Hello and welcome to She Sells, He Sells, where we are here to change the way you think about sales by getting you to look at it in a whole new way. Krista here for a quick and dirty solo episode. This is one I've been wanting to bring to you for quite a while because it is a rule, a principle that ever since I heard it totally changed the way I think about authenticity in storytelling. So as we know, and as you know, as a loyal She Sells, He Sells listener, we spend a whole lot of time talking about the power of stories when it comes to selling. In the world we live in right now, in the business marketplace we are all a part of, in order for your product, your offer, your service, whatever it is to stand out, you need to be behind it. You simply cannot avoid that part of it, that personal touch, that human connection that only you can bring is vital. And that means you need to tell stories. Stories are the ultimate connector. We are hardwired as human beings in order to connect with stories. When we look at the brain science of all of it, the neuroscience of all of it, it ignites a center of our brain that brings emotions and feelings sell before facts and figures do. In fact, stories even give us the opportunity as the listener to have this really crazy phenomenon where we then see ourselves in the story when we listen to someone else's story. I'm sure you've experienced that. Someone's talking about something and you start to imagine yourself in it. Sometimes that's a sad, tragic story and you start to think of, gosh, what if that happened to me? Sometimes that is a exciting story and you dream of yourself in there. So stories are powerful. In order to tell good stories, we need to be authentic. We need to be ourselves. And so that's a non-negotiable when it comes to storytelling. However, where we get tripped up is we don't want to tell all of our deepest, darkest secrets, right? We don't want to feel like we're walking down the street naked every time we show up to share a story on social media, or we get with a client in a client meeting and we want to connect over a story. And that's tricky. That's hard to do because in order to tell good stories, we have to tell true stories. Everybody has really amazing ones to tell, but how do you do it? How do you take a story that you know could really help people connect with you, could really help people see themselves in your story, could really create curiosity around who you are and what you do, capture attention, eventually convert clients, but not feel like you're reading out of your diary, right? And so I want to introduce you to a phenomenon that we refer to as the 30-3-30 principle. So this is 30-3. The first 30 stands for seconds. So 30 seconds. The 3 stands for minutes, 3 minutes. And the next 30 stands for minutes as well, 30 minutes. And the idea is every single story has a 30-second story version, a 3-minute story version, and a 30-minute version. You get to decide which of those versions you're going to share. So if you are trying to share maybe a tricky, hard, vulnerable time, and you don't want to go into details and talk about all of the ups and downs you experienced, there's a way to tell a 30-second version of that story. And that is how you can connect with people without feeling like you're walking down the street naked, right? So let's talk about this. Think of the 30-second version as what you're going to share in a quick Instagram reel. Something short, snappy, right to the point. The 3-minute version might be the story you lead a presentation with. You want to give a bit of context, but you don't want to, go into too much detail. And then the 30-minute version, that's the kind of story version you're going to end up sharing with your friend over a glass of wine. Okay? So what does this look like? How could this look? Let's take an example story and think of the 3 different versions of it. And I wanted to use an example that a client actually brought up in a recent coaching session. And so she was talking about a particularly difficult phase of her life where her husband was diagnosed with something that was life-changing, a health condition. And because of his health condition and the pain that she knows he's in all the time and what he deals with on a day-to-day basis, she has this feeling of guilt and shame anytime she feels like she struggles with something herself. So she gave an example of a time where she woke up really sick and she feels bad saying, "Oh, I feel so bad today and I think I need to go to the doctor." And so she puts her needs to the side because of this guilt and because of the comparative suffering that she's doing. She's comparing her suffering to her husband's and she knows it's not nearly as bad. And by putting her needs last in this physical way, it kind of triggers putting all the needs last, and it's this really slippery slope and this, whole snowball effect that is affecting her in every area of her life, not just her health, but in her role in the family, in her professional life, in everything, in the way she looks at herself, putting herself second or usually last. So there's the overview of the story. So if she was going to tell the 30-minute version of the story, this is the easiest version to tell because we spill everything, right? We give all the details. We set the scene. We're giving dialogue probably. We're adding all the characters in. Maybe she has kids that were involved in it. Maybe it spilled over to client work. I mean, you're going through everything. So think of a time where you're dishing with a friend and you're kind of going through something particularly challenging. You tell everything. You probably tell even too much. You're venting. That's the 30-minute version of a story. And so when we think of telling our story on social media to use it to connect with clients, we think, I have to tell them everything. I have to tell them about, the time that I got so frustrated, I ended up losing my shit on my kids and cussing like crazy. I have to tell how, I cried in my bed for 3 hours because I felt so bad about it. I have to tell about the intense pain my husband's in, and this feels like a betrayal to my kids and myself and my husband. And so that's why we decide not to tell the story, because we're imagining the 30-minute version of that story. And again, these are just numbers as markers. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but my stories that I tell my friends are longer than 30 minutes. I could go on for probably a full 60 minutes. But you get the picture. This is the story that has all the details. And that version of the story, the 30-minute version of the story, that story is never going to make its way to social media. It should not make its way to social media 9 times out of 10. Sure, there are exceptions, and sometimes it's therapeutic and you need to do it, and sometimes it is a story that deserves all the details and you're ready to share it. But in general, when we're talking about building your brand, using storytelling in your messaging to build that personal brand, that 30-minute version of the story does not belong on social media. It does not belong in a piece of email marketing. It does not belong in a client presentation. That's your version. That's your personal version. Now we can think about the 3-minute version, and then especially the 30-second version. Those are the ones you're going to condense down and share more often. And this is where you get to decide, like, how much of the story do you want to tell? How comfortable with this story are you? I like to say, like, you want to share from a scar, not from a wound. Meaning, if you start to talk about this story and it still stirs up all sorts of things inside of you, and you start to feel pain and it's hard. It's really hard. And I mean hard, like hit you hard in the heart hard. Not like, oh, this feels a little uncomfortable, but I'm ready. Like actually, wow, I'm still in this. This is painful. Number one, might not be a story you should share. And number two, if you feel ready to share it, but it still feels kind of hard, you're going to do that, a 30-second version of that story. Now, if this is a story that is feeling like it's coming from a scar, you talk about it and you're like, you almost feel a sense of empowerment. Like, wow, I've been through it. I conquered that. I'm over it. And I learned lessons. Like I can see in the rearview mirror, the lessons that I've learned from that. That's a great story that a 3-minute version is worthy. So let's go back to this client example, the story of her husband with a really hard, very challenging health diagnosis and her putting all of her own things to the side. The 3-minute version of that story could look like starting with a snapshot in time. So it could look like her kind of taking us to a moment where, she's going through her day and she started to feel a little funky, a little off. And she thought, I'm going to take a 15-minute power nap on my couch. And she lay down on the couch. And when she woke up, boom, it was like that Mack truck had hit her. And she realized like, I'm sick. This might be the flu. This might be something like that's going to take me days to get over. Like this isn't just, I feel kind of off. Like I am actually ill. And while she wanted to lay there and tell her husband and her kids, hey, look, mom's out of commission for today and maybe tomorrow and maybe the day after that, she had this overwhelming sense of guilt. And she could go into details about the sense of guilt and what she was thinking and why she felt so bad about that because of what her husband was going through. And she could talk about choosing to get up and trying to power through, even though it was hard and horrible and she felt worse. And she could talk about the implications of powering through. And then she could kind of take that story and move it into like, and it's not just about my health. I do this in my day-to-day life with my children. When they need something, I put my own needs last. When I know in my business, I need to invest in myself, I feel bad, I feel guilty, I feel like funds shouldn't be going to me. So then she could talk about all these other examples. And that could very easily be a 3-minute story. She could, again, illustrate, paint some details like I did in the beginning, and go into detail about that overarching theme of putting herself last. And then she could spin it a bit, weave it into like how many of us do this as women. And you don't need the husband with a horrible diagnosis to put yourself in that boat. You might be putting yourself last. And here's ways to kind of put yourself first. 3-minute version, longer details. However, sometimes we don't even want to go into that full detail, or sometimes we do the 3-minute and then we want to hit on it again and again in the 30-second. And so a 30-second version of that story could look as something as simple as this. You could say, for the last 10 years, I've been putting myself last. And when I look at it, I know a lot of it has to do with my husband having this really tough diagnosis. And because of what I know he deals with on a day-to-day basis, I feel like all my things pale in comparison. And a lot of us probably do this. It's something that Brene Brown coined the term comparative suffering. We take the things that are hard for us and we compare them to what other people are going through. And we feel like it's just not as bad, so we shouldn't feel bad. And so we stuff our feelings and our needs down. And as a result, we ignore those things. And while we think we're making it better, we're actually making it worse. And I know for me, when it comes to even my own physical health, when I get sick, I like to ignore it because I feel bad feeling bad because I know my husband feels worse. But in fact, it makes me feel worse in the long run. So here's your reminder that your needs, your struggles are valid no matter how they compare to someone else's. And you need to attend to yourself in order to be good to help anyone else. So I didn't time that. That might have been a little over 30 seconds, but you get the picture. We didn't hear about the diagnosis. We didn't hear about her laying on the couch. We didn't hear about the overflow, but we got a little taste of who she was. We got a little picture of what life was like. We saw ourselves in that story because we all can relate, female or male, to a time where we've put our needs last unless you're a narcissist. I don't know why that just popped in my head. Like, well, maybe not a narcissist, but most of us can relate to that feeling. And we see ourselves in that story. And I don't know much about her personal life other than that's something she struggles with. And it's enough. That is enough for me to feel connected. That is enough to give me a taste of her authentic self, for me to feel not only trust in her as an expert, but especially trust in her as a human being, because she's not painting herself to be someone who is, perfect and has no problems. She's showing the real you, real her. And that's what you need to do to show the real you. I'm hoping this makes sense to you. So it's 30 seconds, 3 minutes, 30 minutes. When you are thinking of a story that you have to tell, that you want to share, remember, there are 3 different versions you can share. The 30-second version, the short and snappy, you touch a little bit on it, but then you paint it into the bigger lesson, the bigger meaning. The 3-minute, you're going to go a little deeper on that story. You're going to share some details, but then you're still going to paint it to the bigger meaning. And then the 30-minute, that's you dishing with a friend. And that story very rarely will be a part of your brand narrative. And that's a good thing. That should make you feel empowered to tell your stories. Now here's like a little bonus tip I want to add on for you. Another visual when it comes to telling stories with authenticity that I think could help. And this actually came from the same client. So as she and I were talking, she said, I have this story, but I feel loyal to my husband because it's kind of more of his story than it is mine. I feel like, well, who am I to get up there and start talking about his health diagnosis when that's his story to tell? And I also feel kind of loyal to my kids because it's their dad. Like, who am I to get up there and start talking about, what's going on in our family that's private? And so I feel like this story is good and it really relates, but how do I tell the story without giving up all my family members' personal information? And I relate to this so much personally. About 2 years ago, I finally shared publicly the story of how when I was younger, I struggled with an eating disorder. And the story had nothing to do with the brand, right? It has nothing to do with the business. But shame lives in silence. Shame grows in silence. And it was a huge part of my life, a huge part of what made me into who I am today. And it's definitely a scar, not an open wound. And so I felt like I was tired of making it a secret. I wanted to just kind of put it out there. Just make it not weird if I bring it up in a conversation because it's a part of me. But I didn't know how to do it because, when that eating disorder first started, I was 17 years old. I was living at home with my mom, my dad, my sister. That story was their story too, especially my mom and my dad. That affected them big time. It affected my little sister big time. And so I felt like, I don't know if I want to put this out there because I don't know if I want other people to think of how they had to deal with it. I also know it affected my own personal family, especially my kids. Do they feel comfortable letting everybody know, that everybody that follows me on Instagram know this story and it feels kind of personal and that's about my mom? And other stories as well I have, that many of them involve Brian, because when you're life partners with somebody, that happens, and business partners, that happens. And so, how do you tell these stories that you really do want to tell? You have your own narrative around them, but you don't want to necessarily throw anybody under the bus, or you don't want to give away anybody's secrets. I see this with clients with childhood trauma. They've had really hard things growing up and they want to talk about it, but they don't want their parent to feel like they're a horrible parent, right? So a big part of it is that 30-3-30. You can tell a 30-second version of that story and just give a nod to it. But if you want to go the 3-minute version, this is what I told my clients. So back to that first example of the husband with the health diagnosis. I said, you want to imagine the story and you want to think of all of the characters of the story. So line everybody up in your head. Who are the characters in this story? It's obviously you. And then in her case, it's her spouse, and then it's her kids, and there's probably doctors involved. And, think of everyone. And I want you to think of all those characters standing shoulder to shoulder on a stage. We're all standing on stage. When you tell the story, there is a spotlight. And think of a play, right? A musical. When you watch a play on stage, that spotlight is moving person to person, character to character, because they're all an integral part of the story. But when you are telling a vulnerable, authentic story that is your story, that you really don't want other people to feel like they need to be involved in, even though they kind of are, you want to imagine that spotlight is shining solely on you. So all the characters are on the stage, but everybody's pretty dark except for you. So you're looking at your slice of the story. How is the story yours? So again, back to the client story. She's not going to talk about walking into the doctor's office and getting that diagnosis. She's not going to talk about the treatments that her husband goes through. She's not going to talk about his feelings about it all. That is his story to tell, and if he ever wants to tell it, absolutely he can. She's going to talk about how it's affected her and her life. And without giving his personal information away, she's going to talk about how she's walked through a hard time, how she's learned to be a caregiver. It's her story to tell, just like back to my eating disorder story. It's my story to tell. And if my mom wanted to tell a story about having a daughter and trying to navigate through that, because I know for my mom and my dad, gosh, that was a horrible time for them, where they didn't know what to do and were so frustrated with me. And I mean, that was horrible. She could tell her story without giving away all my secrets of the story. She could tell hers. And my sister about having an older sister, she could tell hers. And my kids about learning that their mom struggled with this when she was younger and how maybe it affected, realizing this about their mom. And, they could tell theirs. We all have our own story to tell, but what we're not going to do is drag other people through the mud with it. So tell it from your point of view. Really reduce any sense of details you're giving about other people, other characters in the story, and come from your own point of view. There's a way to do it with the spotlight simply on you. So I kind of gave you the example of what that looked like for my client when I talked about how she told her story. But when I ended up pulling off the Band-Aid and telling the story of my own eating disorder, I talked about really where it was rooted from. It was rooted in my need for control, rooted in my need for perfectionism. It's really not about food or your body at all. It's about controlling and being able to be in charge of everything and want everything just so. So I talked about that. I talked about how dance was probably a part of it. I didn't talk about my mom, my dad, my therapist, my sister, my kids, my husband, none of it. I talked about me. So imagine yourself on a stage lined up with all the characters of the story, but the spotlight is only on you. You're only allowed to tell your narrative. Actually, just saw the musical Six in New York City, which was so much fun. It's about Henry VIII's 6 wives. And this was a perfect example of this. The show was all about each individual character. The characters didn't even really interact with each other. I mean, they did because of the way the show was presented. If you saw it, you know what I mean. But it was really each slice of Henry VIII's lives with each wife. They didn't talk about the people that had gone before or the people that came after. They talked about their own experience in a very fun, super entertaining way. So you're going to tell your own story. A way, if you're still kind of like, I'm having a hard time with this, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick your favorite movie. So I want you to think of your favorite movie. For me, it's When Harry Met Sally. And I would take the 2 main characters, Harry, which is Billy Crystal, or Sally, which is Meg Ryan, and I would try to tell that story only from Sally's point of view, and then only from Harry's point of view. Now, obviously, those 2 storylines are very much connected, interwoven, but if I'm talking about Sally, I'm not going to say, and then I met Harry, and then we did this, and then we did this, and then Harry did this. Instead, the story's a bit about, I wanted to reinvent myself. I wanted to move from Chicago to New York. And so I ended up driving cross country, with a guy that I barely knew. And I got there, and it was just this journey of reinventing myself. And I met one guy, and I built my career here. And then I met another guy. And then, I thought I was getting married, and then I got dumped. And wouldn't you know, like the guy that, we had these great friends, and we had this overlap with the guy that I met across country, and I started to like think of him in a new way and think of things in a new way, and I evolved in this way, and it ended up that on New Year's Eve we ended up back together. So he's a part of the story, but he's not talking. His details aren't in there. It's about Sally. Okay? So one example of a way to start thinking of things in a different way if you are struggling with yourself. Your stories are yours. And when you control the narrative, when you have something that you're like, gosh, I kind of want to talk about this, it is incredibly empowering to rewrite your own narrative. It is incredibly empowering to tell the story from your own point of view and not allow the cast of characters to influence it, to own your own narrative. And then you get to connect with people more. Then you get to have people know you more. And ultimately, it's going to help your bottom line, whether that is visibility and people knowing you or whether that is selling something. It matters so much. It matters more than the features you're going to list on your website. Trust me on this one. This is what I do. I know this for a fact. So 30, 3, 30, use that rule. Pick which version of the story suits you for what level of sharing you want to do and what level you feel comfortable with doing, and share it. And imagine yourself being lined up on that stage and standing on the stage with all the cast of characters, but the spotlight is only shining on you. That is how you control the narrative. That is how you use stories to empower not only your audience, but yourself. I hope this was helpful to you. I cannot wait for you to get out there and tell your story. Please, if you do this on social media, please tag me. You can tag at She Sells, He Sells podcast, or you can tag me at Krista Dempster. I want to see you sharing your story. I want to hype you up because I believe with every fiber of my being, every single one of us has so many stories we can share that will help connect us to other people. And at the end of the day, isn't that all we really want as humans? We want to feel connected. We want to feel less alone. You have the power to do that with your stories. So go boldly and share them. Thanks for spending this time here with me. If you loved this episode, please go ahead and share it on your socials. Tag us. We are so grateful for you helping us get this content in front of as many people as possible. We will be back here next episode with She Sells, He Sells. Catch you then.